Probably need to put us in a smaller room. Probably need to put us in a smaller room. Topic probably is not as hot as we expect.
Don't even start.
Should we?
But anyway,
Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on South-South relations. I'm Devarajan. I'm the chief economist of the Africa region of the World Bank, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. Before I introduce our panelists, I thought I would give a little bit of motivation for why we are having such a session at the World Economic Forum. And you know, the phrase South-South derives from the original phrase North-South. North-South relations, I think it's fair to say, in Africa were characterized by foreign aid. It was an aid relationship, although increasingly it became one of trade and investment. But then over the last 20 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in South-South relations, particularly China, India, Brazil, and other countries having relations with African countries that have been characterized almost exclusively as trade and investment relations. There is an aid component, but it's much smaller than the trade and investment relationship. And that trade and investment relationship now is beginning to dominate overall trade and investment in Africa relative to the traditional partners. And this phenomenon has been accompanied by relatively rapid economic growth and dynamic private sector in Africa, as we've been hearing at the World Economic Forum these last couple of days. Now that relationship, though, takes on a particular poignancy today. At this point in Africa's history, I think we're facing several potential challenges and opportunities. I mean, first, that growth, the 6% growth that Africa is now experiencing, is both the sign of improved economic policies, but it's also a feature of high commodity prices. Put another way, it shows how dependent African growth is on commodities, which also means that the Africa has not diversified, except for Mauritius. We'll get to that in a minute. And it also means that African growth can be quite vulnerable if commodity prices fall, as they did in 2009, and growth fell to 2% in the continent. Secondly, and perhaps the biggest challenge facing Africa, is employment, particularly productive employment for the 7 to 10 million young people entering the labor force every year. Africa has a very young population, and so this labor force is going to be growing, and we need to make sure that there's productive employment for these people. And finally, on the opportunity side, there's some estimates that China alone will be shedding about 85 million jobs over the next 10 years because of its moving up the value chain and higher wages in China. So there's an opportunity for Africa, which is in need of wage jobs, of formal sector jobs, to attract some of these. Now, to address these opportunities and challenges, we have a stellar panel today, and I'm going to introduce them first, and then we will turn to a discussion among them. First is Amadou Diallo, at the extreme left there, your extreme right. Amadou Diallo is the CEO of DHL Freight, which is part of Deutsche Post DHL. And then next to him is Ashish Thakkar. Ashish is the managing director of the Mara Group in Uganda. And then we have two finance ministers, Pravin Gordhan, who's the Minister of Finance of South Africa, and Xavier-Luc Duval, who's the Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Finance and Economic Development of the government of Mauritius. And finally, we have Zhong Jianhua, who is the Special Representative for African Affairs in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but he is also formerly the ambassador of China to South Africa. So we have people who have been on all different parts of the South-South relationship, and they're ideally suited for this conversation. So now let me turn to Amadou first and ask, from a private sector point of view, what do you see as the challenges and the opportunities for South-South labor-intensive activity in the coming decade in Africa.
Thank you very much. And, thanks for attending. I mean, first of all, I think that, to go back to the facts, since 2009, I believe, if my memory is correct, more than 50% of the volumes of world trade, in terms of volumes, not in terms of value, is actually taking place between the South and the South. Secondly, this opportunity has been possible because in most of the countries in the South, consumers are looking for opportunities to have choices at better prices for better quality. And that has given opportunity for many people in Africa, for example, to be able to source goods that they will use to source in the mature markets, to source them out of China, out of India, or out of other markets. Now, and we are trading in that area because in DHL we are moving goods from many different parts of the world to many different parts of the world because our job is to actually provide goods to consumers and provide a platform of growth for entrepreneurs. Now, having been acting in Africa and in Asia, not so much in Latin America, so I'm not very much expert in what is happening there, so you'd excuse me for that. What I've seen from my eyes is that, yes, there is a shift that is taking place from China into different markets. However, you have to be aware that, Africa is not the only continent that is, or only market that is competing to get these jobs. What I've seen actually in reality is that many jobs have been shifted to Vietnam first. That means Chinese manufacturers have moved their manufacturing plants into Hanoi and that type of places. And going to the textile where the regulation has become a little bit tougher from the European Union. And so we have seen that major countries that have benefited from it were actually countries like Bangladesh because they have all the benefits that we actually do have in Africa in terms of having access to different markets and have lower labor costs because employees are less protected, I would say, or less unionized, or whichever way you take it, than we have in Africa. Now, if I look at it from an African perspective, because I'm Senegalese, so I tend to try to look at it from that perspective, what I see is that we have three types of challenges. The first challenge is that we have a challenge in terms of infrastructure. So nobody will move his manufacturing plant in a market where he cannot get his goods out and reach out to the world. And then, we do not have so many ports or airports that are so well structured and organized that we can sort of assure that if goods are manufactured, they are very quickly disposable to consumers across the globe. And that is something that some markets are working on, in South Africa, etc. People are working on sort of developing their ports in Kenya, but it is not across the African countries because investment tend to be very slow in terms of transforming into real plants that can be operated. Secondly, we have a cost disadvantage in Africa. And when I say a cost disadvantage, I've been working across all the African countries. We tend to have, when I have been trained, I was a young student in Africa, when you finish studying in general and you are an engineer or an MBA extra, you expect a minimum wage that is somehow 2 times, 3 times, 4 times the minimum wage that somebody that has the same training is expecting in Vietnam or in Bangladesh and other markets. And I think that we have a real challenge in terms of making clear to people that have been going through tough education, and it is not easy to get out of the education process in Africa, although it has become easier, that expectation should not be that you are paid like an executive that is working for the government because salaries tend to be higher there, or somebody that is working in an economical environment that allows sort of higher salaries. That goes down to people who are working as manufacturers or workers. I know it from Senegal, so that I'm clean in terms of not touching other countries. In Senegal, it is pretty difficult in my country to convince people that they have to work from Monday to Sunday and that it is allowed because it allows for them to be productive and be able to provide goods at affordable rates to the outside market. So people will tend to stop working on Friday. Most of them are unionized. And I think it is not particular to Senegal, it is particular to most of the countries because we have inherited somehow the French culture or the Portuguese culture, and we tend to believe that we are at the same level, and we are not. And the last one is that, I think that in terms of attractiveness to investors, I was living in Singapore. If a company comes and invests in the shipping in Singapore, they pay zero tax. I do not see any African country where it is the case. And actually in Singapore, they have pretty good infrastructure. And I think that if those markets can allow themselves that type of tax incentive, we have to be a bit more creative in terms of what do we need to do to attract investments in our platforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Amadou. Ashish, what can we do to attract those jobs away from Vietnam and Bangladesh to Africa?
I think starting off with your initial question of opportunities, I mean, it's clearly evident. Today we're 1 billion people. By 2050, we're going to be 3 billion. The consumer market is obviously growing rapidly. 18 cities in sub-Saharan Africa are going to be spending about $1.3 trillion by 2030. We have 60% of the world's arable land. I mean, the opportunities are clearly evident. I think the key thing we've got to focus on, in my opinion, is currently we're still a net importer at the current levels of demand. When this population grows and the middle market grows, and the demand for consumerism is going to be increasing further and further. Being a net importer today, I think our core focus needs to be how do we suffice our own requirement in terms of locally manufacturing for our own markets. Then we should look at exporting as a secondary element. The issues that we have are obviously also clearly evident. We have infrastructure issues. We have power issues. We have logistics. One simple example is one of our companies is a manufacturing plant of corrugated packaging. 6-7 years ago, East Africa was importing a specific type of packaging from Italy and Brazil. So we put up a very modern plant which matches the quality of these in Uganda. But today, to sell into Tanzania, we're not as competitive as somebody from Italy, purely because of logistical costs, which is absolutely ridiculous. We're neighboring, and that's a major challenge. I also think that another major factor is that we need to incentivize, our governments need to incentivize manufacturing on the ground, especially using local raw materials. Currently, importing raw materials just does not make sense. And on the other hand, we're exporting raw materials, which is also another major issue. So I think we need to incentivize manufacturers who are actually going to be using local raw materials, and we can see how that can catalyst the whole thing. So, and one thing that just takes it out of the thing completely is I think we need to stop or even ban the export of raw materials. I think we need to encourage local processing in all elements. So that's my
Okay, thanks. Those are quite provocative statements, so I'm sure we'll have something to say about that. Let me turn to Xavier from Mauritius. From your perspective, are these the constraints? Is it infrastructure? Is it high wages? Is it the lack of incentives for manufacturing?
Thank you. I think it's probably all of those. I think history shows us that the countries that have made the appropriate reforms, taken the appropriate actions, actually have had the desired result in terms of economic development. Perhaps I'd like to say there are two types of actions we can take. One takes a little effort but costs a lot of money. Have a new airport. It's very nice, but it's actually relatively quite easy to do. But other actions which may be more important probably cost very little money, but take a lot of effort, and that's the institutional reforms, the parastatal reforms. These are the things I'm talking about. So these are the two types of effort, and I think given that in Africa, all of us, we do have very little money, we ought really to put a lot of effort into the reforms. And here I'd like to suggest something, because behind all the rhetoric, there needs to be action. And I think we need to say, let's say we take a 12-month time span before the next World Economic Forum meeting, say in Cape Town. What we could do is try and see what is happening in Africa, because a lot of countries in Africa are doing wonderful things. And instead of trying to emulate what happens in Singapore, it's quite hard to do because there's a lot of catch-up, or what happens in the USA, we try and see what's happening in some of the leaders in Africa. Each country is doing something wonderful. And what I would like to suggest is let's take, say, the top 20 most effective reforms that have been effected in Africa, all over Africa. Take this top 20 and let's benchmark that. Let's say within the next 12 months, let's see which countries can actually raise their game and achieve about as best as these countries are doing. And I mean, that's wonderful things. People are talking about visa and access movement of people. I've just learned yesterday that Rwanda has an online visa application system, which we don't have in Mauritius, which I'm going to go back with this idea to our Prime Minister. Now, for instance, in Mauritius, we have customs clearing, which is totally online. You don't see the customs officer. That has many advantages. And so, we can share this with our friends from the region. So I think we need to get to action, and we need to be able to have a limited number of reforms and actions that we need to take and try and move to that, because every journey, even the longest journey, starts with the first step. But there have been wonderful things that have been done. Perhaps one thing I'd like to suggest also concerning the proximity equation, in that we do have this wonderful region that is developing, although I think 6% is far from enough, because if you factor in population growth in the next 10 years, if you're $1,000 per capita today, next 10 years you may only be 1,400, still very, very poor. So in fact, 6% is far from enough, and we have to aim for much better. So I think one of the things that we can do is work more on the proximity equation. We all know that proximity can be a real great competitive advantage. Unfortunately, for all the reasons that we know, Africa tends to be not to be able to deliver on that score because of the trade barriers, the problem of financing, which is all hampering intra-regional trade. So I think here, I don't have a solution, but I think here again, we must ask ourselves, how do we best capitalize on the fantastic opportunities that are in Africa? Now, in Mauritius, as you mentioned, we are very diversified. But unfortunately, apart from our friends in South Africa, where we are able to perhaps sell our consumer goods, mainly textiles, we have a lot of problems selling to the rest of the continent. Because although there are probably very few tariffs left, the problems of raising trade finance, of actually getting across the barriers are enormous. So I think let's get down to action. I think we're all very positive about Africa, and I think there's a call to action here, and within the next 12 months, let's try and get something done. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Pravin, there have been lots of remarks made that I'd like you to look at. Are wages too high? That's Amadou's initial remark. Should they ban the export of raw materials in order to stimulate domestic production? But also from your point of view in South Africa, what can we do to stimulate labor-intensive investment?
Can I make one or two more general points first, lest we become guilty of what Amartya Sen calls GDP wallas. So we, at the moment, want to just look at the 6 or 7%. And the time of history that we're living in requires us to not only ask about the number, but also ask about the growth model that we're using. And in more recent developments, the challenge that I think the African continent needs to address is twofold. One is there's what is now called the convergence factor, which is what you're describing in some ways, through the transfer of manufacturing jobs and other phenomena. In other words, the 2.5 billion marginalized people are getting closer to where the 1 billion more developed people are in the globe. But what we need to realize is that that's not an automatic phenomenon. And we can actually speed it up if we do the right things, which is the point Xavier and others are making. The second, in respect of the growth model, is how do we combine growth with job creation, with reducing inequality and sustainable development as we move towards Rio +20. And it's that combination that Africa has the opportunity to offer the world, if you like, an enlightened growth model. Now, the challenge is, how do you do it if you're paying pittances to people working in a low-cost manufacturing environment? And that's a challenge that governments will have, that's a challenge that labor unions will have, and ultimately that's a challenge that business and society more broadly will have as well. And in discussing what we're discussing, let's be very mindful of that factor. The second is, when Xavier talks about the reforms and Amadou talks about some of the changes we need to make, there's a culture change, I think, that we need to make in Africa if we're going to capitalize on these opportunities. As Amadou pointed out, these things don't come to you automatically. We have to go out and look for it and then retain it once you have it. So how do we create a more symbiotic relationship amongst ourselves is a challenge. Secondly, whether we like it or not, we are interdependent. We don't like to believe that we are 54 independent states, but we are interdependent. Now, how do we get this consciousness going amongst policymakers, which will ensure that we have what you might call cooperative competition rather than negative competition amongst ourselves in Africa? And therefore, ultimately, you need a kind of win-win development outcome, meaning broader society needs to benefit as much as business or government. And that's the problem with the growth model elsewhere in the world today, where your top 0.5%, 1%, and what are called the 1%ers in the world, are creaming off much of the benefits of growth. So in Africa, as we talk about low-cost manufacturing and so on, how do we provide a new model is part of the challenge. And what can we learn from China in this instance as well? In relation to our own subjective shortcomings, many of them have in fact been mentioned, but a lot more effort needs to be put into building regional and Africa-wide institutions that will help us to, for example, move much faster and in an action-orientated way on infrastructure investment. There's a lot of talking that we do. There are lots of plans that we come up with. There are lots of investment conferences we have. I think Xavier pointed out the conversion factor from talking to actual delivery on the ground is very, very low. There's some numbers that I think the IFC has come up with, which says that of 17 PPPs, 7 get done, but it takes 7 years to do it. Now, if that's the scale on which we're going to move on the African continent, we're not going to make progress. The second is clearly skills, development, and innovation capability. Here again, we require collaboration across the African continent. You can't have 54 innovation centers on the continent. Are we willing to cooperate to create 5 innovation centers from which all of us can actually benefit? Because ultimately, competitiveness is linked, and productivity is linked to innovation. So I'm sure we can learn a lot from our Chinese colleagues in terms of how do you get a kickstart into this process. But if we truly, in the next 15, 20 years, want to place Africa on a different trajectory, we're going to have to find innovation capability within our own continent. How do we attract these jobs? Well, I think government, business, and labor needs to find greater levels of synergy about the key questions that will go with attracting these jobs. What incentives do you offer? Do those incentives undermine the tax system in a particular country and the tax base, which in most African countries is minimal anyway? Are we asking ourselves to give away the tax base and then have nothing to offer to one's own citizens is part of the challenge. What kind of wage deals are we going to reach? And what understanding will we have about the migration of that wage deal from what might be a low end of the curve to another end of the curve? And those are issues that we need open conversations about to get there. I think banning the raw material exports and so on might be useful in the short term for a particular set of enterprises, but ultimately the world is an open one, and it's about how each of us exercises both our prerogatives and builds our muscle in order to get a better deal out of world trade that will determine whether we are beneficiaries in this process or not. That kind of defensiveness might be appropriate in the short term, but might not be the right thing in the longer term.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, Jianhua, you were ambassador to South Africa at a time when unemployment in South Africa was 25%. So what can we learn from the Chinese experience to try to bring that unemployment rate down?
Thank you, Shanta. Yeah, it's great to join this forum. For the last few forums I joined in Cape Town, here, there, I think the sign is very clear. Now it's Africa's opportunity. We are now seeing the rising of the economy of this continent. So first, I would like to congratulate my brothers and sisters of Africa. And as Shanta pointed out, that quite a number of few millions of job opportunity is moving out of China. I think that's inevitable. For the last few years, we've seen the increase of salaries from 50% to double. And the people also estimate in the next few years, it could be triple. So the golden years of low-cost labor is fading away in China. I think that's inevitable. Just like all these jobs come into China, there is the day some of them is moving out of China because of our own development. It, to some extent, proves that you're probably successful and you provide decent income for the Chinese ordinary working people. Then we see this as an opportunity for Africa. Yeah, we see the economy transfer quite a number of, or big number of, labor-intensive jobs into this continent. But sometimes also a little bit doubt about that, because opportunity not necessarily sometimes automatically transfer into the job itself. We still need to do a lot of things to prepare for that kind of transformation. Based on my experience in South Africa, the job creation is a big challenge for South African government. And we see this also as one of the things we can do to help in the embassy, in the Chinese government. I also expect some of the Chinese companies in South Africa, and we regard them to be successful because there is a big manufacturing company called Hyson. They run quite a number of assembly lines in the northwest province. I went there to see, on the assembly line, 90% are the local workers they employ. Altogether, they employ more than 3,000 local labor. But still, they have complaints. Apart from that, is that they think the skilled worker is what they desperately need. We have all these kinds of training programs in African countries. And some of them actually, I see some of them are trained abroad, but that's very expensive. And some of them are trained in the classroom. It's quite doubtful sometimes. These people come out of the classroom, being trained, probably not suitable to the assembling line. In Hyson Company, when I visit there, they train the workers on the assembly line. That's quite ingenious creation or thinking. And, but they insist, if you want to do the training on site, training on the assembly line, you do need quite a number of Chinese workers working side by side with them. Otherwise, you cannot do it empty-handed. But to have some Chinese workers sent from China is a big challenge. Not all of them want to go until you have a pretty high salary for them. Then the cost could be higher. And also, there are some kind of immigration restrictions. So I think this is the challenge. We try to work together with the Home Office, try to work out some kind of new pattern we can think about. That is, if you transfer this work opportunity, job opportunity from China or from any other East Asian countries to this continent, we probably also need to find some new ways for the job creation, for the skill training. So this is something I tried to work out when I was in South Africa, and still trying to do it today. We need to find some good models. We can combine all these advantages for both sides together and make it become the reality for the rising of this continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this is a very, very good set of propositions, some more controversial than others. Actually, let me turn to Xavier, because you were being quite modest in talking about Mauritius's experience, because I think in many, and you were talking about what are the lessons to be learned from success stories. If you could talk a bit about how Mauritius has managed to address the skills constraint over time, because you were initially in the sugar plantation, sugar business, then we moved to textiles, and now moving to electronics and maybe even to services. How did you make that transition and maintain labor-intensive production?
Thank you. The first thing, I think, after independence, we went very much into education. So free education in Mauritius, right from primary, secondary, and mostly tertiary education. So that was the first thing we did. And secondly, I think we looked differently at the tax issue. Instead of considering that we should have high tax rates, we looked at having high tax revenues. And often the two don't work together. Often the lower the tax rates, the higher the tax revenues. So in fact, as from 83 onwards, we brought down substantially the tax, especially taxing foreign enterprises, even down to zero in most cases. And that brought in a lot of investment from overseas into the textiles industry. Our population at that time was highly unemployed, so they're very happy to work in the textile industries. We benefited from preferential access to Europe and to the USA at the time, and that all helped. Now, then obviously following on from other countries, we moved up the scale. People were less keen to work in the textile factories, and so we moved up into ICT, we moved up into other financial services strongly, and we see nowadays that in fact the economy is so highly diversified that even with this crisis in Europe, and even though 60 to 65% of our revenues actually come from Europe, still we'll manage about 3.6, 4% growth this year. So it's a question, I think, of education. It's a question also of taxation, of economic policies. But also, just one thing I'd like to mention, which is very important, I think, is when we're talking about transformation of Africa, sometimes we talk about economic transformation, but we need to talk about social transformation. And that's probably as important as the other things. And in Mauritius now, we've adopted a 10-year economic and social transformation plan to try and get us from middle-income country to higher-income country. And we need to address the issue of productivity. We are much less productive than the Chinese workforce, for instance. And we need to look at the attitude of the population to work, the attitude of the population to productivity, the attitude of the population to environment, to health, etc. So really, we think we have a long way to go, but we're very happy to share whatever we have learned.
Amadou, you mentioned that even education, or maybe because of education, it's very hard to get people to work in these manufacturing sectors. You were describing the engineers who come out of university in Senegal and are unwilling to work at the wage rates that, say, their counterparts in Vietnam or Bangladesh would be willing to work. So what can we do if Mauritius has been able to do that? They've been able to educate the population to the point where they actually are competitive in global markets.
I mean, I don't know everything about Mauritius, but what I've learned is that actually Mauritius has been sort of somehow a very open economy in terms of allowing workers to come in and to get out, right? Now, if I just stay in that region, I take Angola and the SADC, all right? Most of the companies that operate in Angola sort of struggle to find people who work in finance, and the finance guy in Angola costs you, 3 times the cost of an offshore platform in India. And actually what happens is that most of the people who are operating in Angola are shifting jobs to India instead of the SADC region sort of aligning itself so that we can move them to Namibia, to Zambia, or Zimbabwe, I don't know, whichever market sort of offers opportunities. And that's where, our integration is sort of, we have great ambitions, but it is not pragmatically working. And I think that we need to really work on lifting these barriers down. It should be easy for people to move from South Africa to Angola, from Angola to any other place in the SADC. It should be easier than any other body coming inside this region. First thing, The second thing is that when we're talking about education, we need to, I think, choose our sectors, So we cannot beat the guys in Ahmedabad and Hyderabad in terms of life science, because that battle is gone. We have to understand that battle is quite a lost one, because we will be starting too late. So we have to pick sectors where we see opportunities, and going through sectors, that means that when Pravin was talking about innovation centers, I think that we really need to study the market and say, which are the sectors where we can fight. And for those sectors, you have very different verticals. Yesterday we heard a lot about agriculture, and I think that is a sector that we can fight on because we have enough people, we have land, it is disposable, etc. And then you can work on the transformation, but we really need to focus on sectors and then educate the people, focus on those sectors, because you cannot sort of try to fight all the battles in the automotive, in life science, in service area, etc., because then you disperse your resources, and we don't have enough resources. And lastly, I think Xavier mentioned it before, it should really not be more complicated for Africans to move around Africa than it is for them to move to Europe or to the US or to Asia. If I travel to Philippines, I'm asked for no visa. There's no country in Africa, potentially, where I don't need a visa. So, and it takes 3 days because it's not automated, etc., and people don't have the time.
Good, thanks. Okay, Ashish, I'm going to come to you now. You heard what Pravin said about your suggestion about banning exports of raw materials, but I want to add to that the question, really raise the point that you raised, which are the huge problems with logistics that are plaguing African enterprises, like your packaging plant in Uganda. Well, if that's the case, how do you think that banning raw material exports will lead to efficient beneficiation or processing of those raw materials when the logistical capacity of what we already have is so weak?
So I think I agree with Pravin. We are in a world trade market, and it's not good to be in a defensive mindset. But we do need a catalyst, right? We need a catalyst of some sort. So if that's not the case, then we need serious reforms from the public sector, be it incentives, and I think Mauritius is a fantastic example with incentives. Infrastructure, I think the mindset also needs to evolve. We've been talking about it. We've seen a few case studies here and there of public-private partnerships when it comes to road, when it comes to rail, when it comes to power. I think that's something that needs to be more focused on as well. Further to Amadou's point, I think we need a more focus on vocational institutions, building our skill set, because that's what's also going to attract. Again, that can be done as a public-private partnership. As the ambassador was saying earlier, China has not focused as much as Africa has, and still they've had some great growth. So I think, again, we cannot expect government to be good at everything, but they need to kind of set the platform for private sectors to also plug into. Another issue is, I think, we can all see the world is evolving, right? It's not just profit focused now, right? There's a lot of other issues such as food security. So I think Amadou's absolutely right, where we do need to focus on a few sectors, and I think that's one of them. It's good to take case studies as India and China, but I think it's also important to create our own game learning from these other examples. So I think those are the few issues. And another thing we've got to take note of is we are running pretty inefficiently today, right? And are still so profitable. So I mean, if we put some efficiencies in the system, I think it can really further catalyst the growth.
Thank you. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to pick up on, I think, what Pravin called, cooperative competition? I thought it was competitive cooperation. It could be both. And to ask how we can make this work. Jianhua, China might be an example of that, because in China you have local governments that are competing with each other, and yet you have infrastructure that actually seems to work across jurisdictions. How can we make that happen in Africa?
Well, let's choose a couple of areas. If you take vocational training, can we share training facilities? Can we share trainers? Once we've decided on the sort of focal areas in different regions on the African continent? Or do all of us want to do our own thing? And which if we try to do, will take another 10 years to set up the institutions and the mechanisms that we have. And this is not just competition between governments as well. I've been talking to a colleague from South Africa yesterday. Cooperation between the private sector and governments, where the private sector, where it thinks it has particular competencies, contributes to vocational training and makes its facilities available. In many countries, for example, certainly in South Africa, apprentice systems died for some reason in the 1990s and early 2000s. And as a result, we now have a shortage of artisans. In South Africa, certainly, in other parts of Southern Africa as well. if we want these levels of growth and these levels of sophistication, and if anything to do with engineering is part of the focus, we're going to need artisans. Somebody should try and, maybe you in the World Bank needs to do some numbers for us in terms of what we need versus what we produce at this point in time. Secondly, regional value chains versus country-based value chains. Again, not enough work. I think Asia provides some interesting models, and China's relationship with their Asian partners, and indeed on the global scale as well, as I'm sure Amadou and others will point out. In other words, if we building cars in a particular country, can one country provide the windscreen, another provide the tires, another provide the dashboard, and so on? Or do we want to produce everything in just one country? And this is part of the cooperation part, because you've got to live and let live in this kind of environment in order that the region as a whole is able to boost itself as opposed to one entity within the region itself. Third will be marketing and access to markets and supply chains. There too, I think, if all of us want the airports, all of us want airlines to Europe, all of us want the cheapest way to export things, are we going to actually achieve that? Are there areas of cooperation there that we could actually build? So those are examples. At the same time, we're going to compete for markets, right? We're going to compete on price. We might be competing in other areas. But here's a model worth looking at if we want to leapfrog some stages of our development as we want to achieve the aspirations that we set out.
Jianhua, can you react to that as well as my question?
Yeah, just I have said that the job creation or job shifting from Asia to Africa is inevitable, but not necessarily become the reality, because create job is only one part of the task you have to face, but environment, just like Minister Gordhan just said, you need the whole environment. What we have in China, our experience that the local government is so active in attracting capitals to their own area. Probably sometimes they go too extreme, but anyway, so we sometimes have the Chinese company come to Africa, complain to the embassy, say that we do not have the necessary support from the local government in African countries. Actually, I say they are spoiled. They are spoiled in China, because the officials so often come down to say, what can I do to help your business? Sometimes they even help the company to employ workers to work into the factory. We do have quite widely criticized cases recently in China. The officials are being given tasks that if you cannot employ enough workers to work in the assembly line, excuse me, you yourself have to work there. That's went too far. But anyway, I think this is some kind of examples we can introduce to our African friends that you probably need to mobilize not only the central government, but sometimes at different levels, even including the lowest levels official, to create an ideal environment for industry, for economy, for company, will be also one of the big jobs for the local government. They have all sorts of problems, water supply, electricity, and sometimes for the transportation, for the road work, and sometimes for labor relations. So these things, I think we all need to put into thinking before we see the full realization of take the opportunity of job shifting into this continent.
But if I could push that a bit, I mean, how do we get this cooperation that Pravin was talking about on the value chain and all of these other things when we can't get cooperation on some basic things like trade? When we can't get cooperation on agreements which governments have already agreed to? I mean, there's a view going around, and there have been articles written that we should have no more regional agreements in Africa. Just implement those that we've already signed up to. Mm-hmm. Those are very good agreements about trade and services, movements of persons, and yet they haven't been implemented. So it's still very difficult to get from Lagos to Accra, even though the rules say you should have free movement of persons between Lagos and Accra. So what can we do to break this deadlock? Anybody want to?
For a start, I mean, it's that culture change that I spoke about earlier on. Mindsets need to change, whether it's amongst politicians, amongst business, where we need to see the continent as a whole as our playground rather than just our little turf that we might actually have. The second is a greater sense of urgency to deliver. And I don't think that the forces of competition are hitting us hard enough, or the forces of opportunity. In other words, it's not staring us in the face strongly enough so that we have to add an element of passion and urgency around this. And perhaps the third is that our people need to be better informed so that they push politicians and business organizations to get the right synergies and the right levels of urgency, because ultimately they're the beneficiaries, hopefully, of the developments that we see. So these are doable things, but in addition to the economic reforms that we're speaking about, these are, if you like, societal and institutional reforms that we need to undertake as well.
I think also that comes back to my point that we need to have an annual agenda and have a timetable of what is actually achievable. Because we can say a lot of things, but a lot of that we know we cannot get done. As you mentioned, a lot of the things actually we promise, even though the laws may exist, they're not actually enforced by each country. So we do need to have an agenda which may not be that optimistic or that great to start with, but at least we know we can get it done. And also perhaps I'd just like to mention the role of FDI into all this. I mean, not just the capital, but the technology also has to come from overseas in many cases. And in the case of Mauritius, it came from overseas. And we need to have, I think, a more proactive approach in attracting FDI. And that means also in terms of our agreements, our double taxation agreements, our investment protection agreements, which are necessary to mitigate the risks that people see in investing on our continent.
Ashish, what can we do to get your packaging plant to be more competitive than the Italian one in Tanzania?
I think it really boils down to infrastructure, and I think also these regional trade agreements, like you said, they're fantastic, but they need to be in action fully. I also think the other element is the debate is, do we really want to be a low-cost manufacturing base, as we were discussing earlier as well? Is that something that we really want to be? Does it help the social transformation that we want? And my opinion is yes, we do, because I think we need to start somewhere. We've got a very high unemployment rate in a lot of our countries, and like China has the issue today, but it didn't, of now it's moving up the value chain, right? But it didn't have that luxury 5-10 years ago, and we're in that situation today. I think a point that Xavier also touched upon is, the social transformation is a very critical one. Another small example of one of our other businesses is the business process outsourcing business, right? Which is not manufacturing, but it's in the service industry. And there's nothing stopping us tapping high-end and low-end. We started our BPO business about 16 months ago. We're in 7 African countries, employing around almost 3,000 people now, right? Doing 12 different languages. So the point is, we can compete. And now the next stage is going to be, how do we compete with India and the others, Philippines, etc., right? So I think there needs to be a starting point. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I may add to your question, I think that there are a few things that we can do. I mean, in the private sector, when we have plans and we agree on things, when we don't realize them, we get sanctioned by our customers. And I think that within the regional integration that we do have, where we have agreements that need to be implemented, there should be sanctions for those who don't implement it. Then people know that if I don't implement it by the deadline, then I have to pay. That's because that's what we do in the private sector sometimes. And then the second thing is, most of those sanctions are not, most of those regulations are not being lifted because it is related to a governance issue. And it is related to some subjects that we touched upon yesterday when we were talking about corruption. And I think that, we can talk a lot about great intentions. We have to have a joint red card to corruption agenda, and then we need to implement it because, it is being implemented in many Asian markets that are competing with us. So there are a few things that it's not rocket science that have been implemented in ASEAN, in ASEAN +3, etc., that we need to replicate in our market so that we are as attractive in terms of sustainability, etc., so that people can come in. And that's true that we have a lot of agreements, as you said. We just need to implement them.
Okay. Very good. I think it's time now we can turn to the audience. You've been very patiently listening, but now it's your chance to ask hard questions of us, and I'll take maybe 2 or 3. There's a microphone coming. Yes, the gentleman in the front row.
Yeah, Mutambara from Zimbabwe. I think we need to understand why regional integration is not taking off, why the good ideas from Minister Gordhan are not being done. It can't be business as usual. We need to move away from emphasis on the national interest to the regional interest. Emphasis from the national sovereignty to regional sovereignty. Meaning, differently, we can say we must give up some elements of national sovereignty and embrace regional sovereignty. We must understand our national interest within the context of the regional interest. The logical conclusion which leaders must come to terms is, maybe the logical conclusion is that we don't need 54 presidents. There'll be one president and there'll be ministers throughout Africa. And the African leader is not ready to give up that power at a personal level. That's the challenge we need to address.
It's not just the African Union, it's the European Union that's not willing to give that. Okay, any other? Yes, in the second row? Oh, third row.
Thank you very much, Nabiyu Samuel from Midrock, Ethiopia. Luckily, the owner of this hotel. So I just want to ask our Chinese colleague, as you all know, Ethiopia is, within its, growth and transformation planning for the next 5 years, ambitious plan, no doubt. But we are tracking along. And in line with that, the Midrock Group has embarked in a very ambitious program as well. We just recently commissioned, the largest cement plant in Ethiopia, 8,000 ton a day, with the Chinese, contractors and companies. And I've seen in that process close to, 2,000 Chinese employees working on our plant. And during the operation, we will have another 200, 300 Chinese, skilled and semi-skilled, employees working for us for the next 2 years or so. In terms of this cooperation, and if I go in the larger scheme, in the power sector, in the road sector, in Ethiopia alone, we have over 100,000 Chinese, without exaggeration. And the rest of Africa, one can imagine. So we like to see some of this cooperation coming along, in the training process, as the minister from, South Africa has elaborated as well. So do you have any plans? In particular, one of the obstacles I see picking up knowledges and skills from our Chinese friends is the language barrier. You have 1,000 Chinese, we have 1 translator or 2 translators, management and local workers, no way to figure out. So what kind of cooperation and assistance and long-term trainings, in this area, the Chinese, are working on? Of course, the Ethiopian government has also, to have its own, labor policies, plannings, and all that stuff. Thank you.
Okay. We can take one more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Watanabe, working for Japan International Cooperation Agency, similar organization as Dr. Devarajan working for. Now, I would like to give one example of if development cooperation being properly addressed and designed, that could have a great benefit in terms of South-South cooperation. Yesterday in this room, Ms. Josetta Shilan mentioned about Brazil's becoming from food importing country to food exporting country throughout 70s and 80s. And I'm proud to say that JICA has been cooperating to Brazil for that end in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, in the Cerrado area in Brazil. Now, a few years ago, Brazil, Mozambique, and Japan concluded a 3-parties agreement called Pro-Savannah Project, in which Brazil is aimed to transfer its experience in agricultural area to Mozambique, and Japan, in addition to helping Brazil to transfer its experience to Mozambique, providing infrastructure in the Nacala corridor so that in the future, farmers can export their products to abroad. Now, in Mozambique, there is already a Japanese company like Mitsubishi has been cooperating, investing, but with this new project called Pro Savannah, I think more investment from Brazil and Japan would be expected. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I think the two of these were comments rather than questions, but perhaps Jianhua, you want to take the comment about how we can increase the knowledge exchange from China?
Thank you very much. Yes, the gentleman asked me about this Chinese project here or Chinese companies here. We have some Chinese workers working here, and how can we combine in the future to make this project also combine with job creation and job training? I think it's a big challenge. You know, enterprises, they are economic animals. All the actually working here and anywhere in the world, in China, the profit is always what they are thinking about, or the most important thing. So whatever they can do to cut the cost is the target. If they can have a cheap Chinese labor, skilled one, productive, they always have the intention to get more from China. But as Chinese government, we claim ourselves to create a win-win situation. That is not only to make a project, but also to create the opportunity and development for local people. And then you certainly need to use the project as an opportunity for at least training some local people. Just like we have done that in Tanzania and Zambia Railway. Alongside with 10,000 Chinese workers and technicians, you have about 300, or I'm sorry, 30,000 local laborers, local workers working together with them. At the end of the day, when you finish the project, you leave them with a troop of skilled technicians and skilled workers. But that kind of practice, unfortunately, was not widely accepted today or being practiced today. So I personally, I think we probably still need to see something new in this kind of two extremes. On one side, you have the low-skilled local workers, you probably don't want to use them. On the other side, you have cheap labor, you get them from China. Both alternatives, I don't think that's quite conceivable or quite practical. So probably we need to take a road in the middle with the encouragement, perhaps sometimes with the guidance of the Chinese government and the local government to provide this kind of opportunity for the Chinese company or even other companies, and also on one side with the local people join together. We give them the task, when you finish this, you do not only finish the project, but you also finish with leaving them with a local working team who can maintain this, probably also can increase the opportunity and to have skilled labor for the local country. That's my suggestion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Pravin, do you want to take the comment from the gentleman from Zimbabwe about global government or African-wide government? Because you did make the point that we need to inform the public so they can put pressure on politicians to promote a regional integration, which is an interesting point coming from a politician. But the question is, those politicians are still national politicians, and they have to answer to their local constituency.
And that's one of the contradictions that we face in the globe today, and you can see it in Europe. How you say a particular set of things to win the votes in your elections, and then when regional and international and global developments take place, which run contrary to where you've placed your country and your let's call it your political rhetoric, you run into a contradiction. Then you have the dilemma, how do I go back to my people and explain to them, I'm going to do something different from what I actually said, because the environment around me has changed. So that's one political economic challenge, if you like, we face. The second, where I agree with Mr. Mutambara, is that we are living through a period where we need to do some rebalancing in terms of national versus regional, national versus global interest. You can't sit in a G20 meeting or in the United Nations or in a World Bank environment, for example, and say, I will only act in my country's interest. If there are certain things like sustainable development, like a global growth model, like overcoming this financial and debt crisis through collective action, which requires collective action. It can't be done by any one entity. And I wish Mr. Mutambara luck with his dream about one president for the region.
Okay. I think we have time for a few more. Yeah. Can you get a mic here?
Thank you. Chukwuemeka Chikezie, an advisor to the Global Forum on Migration Development and the government of Mauritius. Yesterday, the Honorable Minister of Finance of Mauritius hosted a luncheon to talk about labor mobility and skills. And one of there were 3 government ministers present, and one of the issues that came up, picking up really on this lack of implementation, was the idea of bilateral agreements as a first step towards getting greater inter-African mobility of skills and labor. And I wonder whether the panel could comment on that. Is that perhaps a way forward? Greater, I mean, among the coalition of the willing, or the variable geometry, perhaps, those countries that are actually more willing to move in that direction, taking the first step. Second question to Mr. Diallo, and picking up from the Honorable Chinese Ambassador's point about this model of using foreign labor initially, but then a sort of transfer. I wonder, with your point about skills, what specific forms of public-private partnerships involving the private sector, involving the public sector, can we actually think about to facilitate this sort of skills transfer, so that there might be a quid pro quo between yourself and the government, where you're allowed to bring in labor, but then there's this, the win is that there's also this transfer. I'd like maybe some more specifics on that. Thank you.
Okay. Amadou first, and then Jianhua.
Okay. First, Amadou, he said so. You know, from what I've seen, so we operate in many different markets, and I have had the chance to sort of operate in countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, in Japan, Korea, because we have many more models than just the Chinese models, you know, because we're only talking about the Chinese models, so we operate also in India. There are many different markets and there are many different models. But what we have seen, and we're also operating in South Africa, by the way, on the oil and energy. So what you see when you're trying to operate in a country, you don't always necessarily need to bring all the labor force in a country to be able to operate. You might need to bring the high-level expertise, you know, sort of the engineers or people who have been implementing manufacture plants, etc., but you don't need to bring in all the workers to be able to execute the job. Now, that was also to the question that was asked by our Ethiopian colleague. Now, the thing is that, you know, if you don't want to have that point, that means that you have to be able to provide workers that are as cost-effective and qualified as China would like to bring. And I think that, you know, what we do have as the Chinese model is that they bring the engineer, the plant manufacturer, the labor worker, everybody that is working in the group, and then when they finish, then you're stuck with a problem because you have to maintain the goods extra. And there, I think it's a matter of us also regulating that, yes, you can bring in management. Yes, you can bring in sort of the core of the team that is managing the project because it's coming with some processes, but there is some base load that needs to be provided from inside the country. These are regulations that can be provided by our countries, or they just swallow everything and then they have accepted something that they should not accept. Now, in terms of public-private partnership, always, you know, you have obligations that are sort of agreed to by the one that is investing to companies, and those obligations need to be measured. You know, when we go in China or we go in Singapore or we go in other markets and we get incentives, we get audited by the government that is giving an incentive as to are we achieving the milestones that we have agreed to so that it justifies the incentive that we have got. And I think that we can get that same type of sort of public-private partnership in Africa, but it needs to have some sort of counterparts that are qualified enough to be able to measure the one that is investing. And I don't think that it is always applicable in every market that we have in Africa. These would be my 2 points.
Jianhua?
Yeah, to answer the question, actually at the present, what I can, when I put forward these ideas, because based on some experience of a Chinese company who is already here, who has already trained some of the local people into working into assembly line to be successful. But it is certainly not wide scale yet, because of a certain other reason, because the job opportunity, because of the local environment, because of the market demand. All these things restrict this kind of experience to be expanded to some other areas. But now we have seen this shifting of the work opportunity from Asia to Africa. So probably we need to sit down together with the company, the government, Chinese government, and the African government, and any project running on. Then we probably need to work together to work out a model which we can promote, which we can expand. But at the present stage, I say it's not yet that widely accepted or become practical yet. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're coming to the end. So rather than summarizing it, let me tell you a few things that I may have learned from this conversation, which has been extremely stimulating, and really appreciate what people have said. Just two big points. I would say that there seems to be quite a lot of agreement among the panel on the diagnostics, on what the constraints are. And we reiterated some of them on education and skills, infrastructure, the business environment. But I think there were a few more that we don't usually talk about, but we should, which is the attitude to work, the willingness to work, the culture change that people were referring to earlier, and then also being able to walk the talk, to implement the agreements that we've already signed up to implement the policies that are on the table already. Now, how we're going to go about this is extremely difficult, and I want to emphasize that this is not just tinkering at the margins. This is really fundamentally the culture change that people have been talking about, or the catalyst that Ashish was referring to. And it's interesting that I think the Mauritius case illustrates how you have to do this at a national level. You need that national consensus. But then we also talked about the regional level. So you can't just stick with getting the national level right, as Mauritius points out too. When you're trying to cooperate at the regional level, you need to go beyond the things, that, although they're very important, things that need to be done at the national level. And maybe think broadly, the way we are thinking more broadly at the national level about public-private partnership. I think this idea that Pravin mentioned of public-private regional partnerships is one way maybe, because certainly the private sector, they don't care much about boundaries, about borders. They're willing to work across borders very easily. So if we can get more public-private partnerships, particularly in some of these difficult areas, like training, innovation, and so on, we could make a lot of progress. So I think the note of optimism that we started this discussion with survives. I think the potential for South-South cooperation being the major engine of bringing labor-intensive growth to Africa is still there. We've learned a lot about how to make it happen. Now it's up to us to walk the talk and make sure it happens. So on behalf of the panel and the audience, I want to thank you for a very interesting discussion. Yeah.